Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Sunday night session of taking a little bit closer look at a particular industry analysis. In this case, I'm joined by Hugh McManus. Hugh is a contributing, very strong contributor investor here at Manifest Investing, and we're really appreciating him from taking out some time from his day job as a pharmaceutical scientist to share more information on drug development in the pipelines. My name is Mark Robertson. I am founder and managing partner of Manifest Investing, and we thought we'd spend just a few minutes giving you guys a little bit of background. We will be recording the session tonight. It will be available on YouTube and in the Manifest discussion forum, and we do want to give the audience tonight a little more background. We have some people from a couple of different communities joining us tonight, so we want to spend some time giving them some orientation, and just want to say, reach out and say welcome to any newcomers. We do welcome participation, and please feel free to enter comments and questions into the questions tab. Either Hugh or myself will be monitoring that as we go along. We'll make copies of the PowerPoint presentation available. You can contact either one of us with comments, questions, or requests. Our two email addresses are shown there. And I don't think Hugh's got any problem with people reaching out to him for follow-up either. Fair statement, Hugh? He must be muting himself again. All right, let's go ahead and take
Sorry, Mark, I just dashed out to get a...
No, not a problem. Let's go ahead and take care of the legal stuff first. We are going to be talking about possibly some specific stocks tonight. We won't spend a lot of time getting too deep into the Vivus or Arena Pharmaceuticals, but in the case where we do talk about real companies in real time, keep in mind that we are talking about educational demonstration and sharing of ideas, and everything is for illustrative purposes only. No investment recommendation is intended. Please do your own homework. Here's the agenda that basically is put together for tonight. We do want to give some perspective on what these communities are all about. And Hugh, if you want to walk through and just kind of describe some of the stuff you'll be covering.
Yeah, originally the idea actually was to look more in depth at Vivus, which has a drug, Conexa, which was originally scheduled for approval, or decision at least, on the 17th of April. And the FDA extended that by 3 months. So we scrambled and changed the entire talk, and I think it's a little bit better because now we're really focused on the development and the approval process, which was going to be in both talks. Now it's concentrated here. And then in 2 weeks, we can take a more in-depth look at both Vivus and Arena, digging into the filings that are up here on the FDA website, the press releases, etc., look at their clinical trial results. And I guess you could even wager on the chances that either will get approved. But for now, at least, we'll go through the clinical development, the drug application, clinical trials, etc., then the drug application and approval. And I will give you a number of resources that you could use to investigate these kinds of things for yourself. And if you want a copy of this talk, that's not a problem. There's a PDF file ready to go. It's on the Manifest website, and if you're not a member of that, I think, Mark, you get the email address of either of us, and we can send that PDF.
Right, and we would be happy to provide that. So really, it does become kind of a comprehensive look from Hugh's perspective as a pharmaceutical scientist on how to delve for and discover opportunities and how to follow them throughout the development process. So that's the lion's share of what we will be talking about tonight, at least from if not 35,000 feet, maybe from 12,000 feet or something like that. Here's a quick summary. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time describing Manifest Investing. Again, about a good portion of our audience are investment club people that are familiar with the modern investment club movement. Just thought we'd give some exposure to some of you who may not be. Some of our other attendees are from places like StockTwits, which Hugh and I found to be just a wealth of information, stocktwits.com, and some of you have actually probably joined us because of seeing stuff that we've begun to do in affiliation with StockTwits. We see a lot of potential there. The modern investment club movement, though, does date back to 1941, and it really does boil down to a fairly effective, disciplined, patient process of looking for long-term opportunities. And we'll take a look at a couple of those here and be a little bit more specific. At Manifest Investing, we basically take the lessons of that long-term investing philosophy or process and basically try to understand the business model of a company. That upper graph that you see there basically represents an attempt to understand in greater detail the business model for any particular company. And from the top line here is sales, to the bottom line, earnings, and then obviously the difference between the two represents the relative profitability of the company. So we do try to understand what's different about some of the stuff that Hugh will be talking about tonight is you're basically talking about a company, kind of back here towards this end of the spectrum. In other words, pre-emerging, or a company that is literally just beginning to generate profitability in terms of earnings per share. And so you're really talking about the early stages of a company as it begins to deliver positive earnings per share. So we do really focus in on two core characteristics as a result of that study. The first being a return forecast for any company, exemplified by the projected annualized total return. And then we do spend a lot of time talking about the quality of companies. And that basically boils down to an analysis of four major factors. Strength of balance sheets, measured by the financial strength, you could think investment grade rating for the company, the stability of results, known as the earnings per share stability, and then competitive comparisons for the growth and profitability of the company between it and some of its competitors. One of the neat things is Hugh kind of steps through this here over the next few weeks. As we look at this specific process, we are talking about direct competition between a couple of companies as they try to develop solutions for the obesity pill that's in development. We do like to share this graph here. It's basically a model portfolio that we keep track of at Manifest Investing in our monthly e-newsletter. And it's, as it says down here at the bottom, this is kind of the important part. We started with 0 and basically simulated somebody in their 401k plan putting in the maximum amount between now and then. And approximately $200,000 invested in this at this point in time, following the methodologies of the modern investment club movement and some of the stuff you see on the right-hand side of this slide. Very strong influence of Value Line, for example, and the philosophies and methods of people like Walter Schloss. It's a name that you might want to dig in. If that name is new to you, you might want to dig in and figure out who he was and what he did. We're going to be actually sharing a session on Walter in the coming weeks here at Manifest, along with a few other people like Phil Carrot and obviously Warren Buffett and a few others. But the really neat thing here is we just had our $1 million moment within the last few days of actually reaching 7 digits in this particular demonstration where we are showing it is possible to do this sort of thing. And just out of curiosity, for those of you that are new to this stuff, here are the companies that are involved in achieving that $1 million right now. Again, every month in our newsletter, we basically describe any portfolio decisions or transactions and why and when we do them, so you can follow along transaction by transaction. And frankly, we love to discover some of the type of companies that Hugh is going to be describing. Exciting, promising companies that have a lot of growth potential. I think SolarWinds, it's in the IT business, is an example of that. That company is up actually magnificently for us here over the last 6 to 9 months. So we do like to discover companies fairly early in their life cycle process. So again, just to reinforce what we're about, we basically try to take this stuff. He's going to try to take the pharmaceutical or drug development pipeline tonight and break it down into something to make it a little bit more understandable. I'm sure he'll be using lots of figures and stories to help that process. And basically, we just try to boil this all down into those two major factors of following return forecasts and quality in helping to demystify and unfog the challenges facing all of us as long-term investors. Again, just to kind of repeat, we're here attempting to implement the lessons that we've learned. We're here for the returns. We really think that anybody can do this as long as you learn the patience and discipline of focusing in on the returns and the quality of companies. And we obviously we have complete sessions on those type of subjects, but we just wanted to kind of emphasize that for tonight. We really do try to find the people who seem to have a pretty good handle on the world of commerce and do attempt to invest in the best where at all possible. Just for kicks, we are going to be, this is kind of a commercial for a future program that we're going to have approximately 1 month from now, where we basically talk about a great story, the great story of the grand experiment known as the investment club movement, where we're going to dig in a little bit deeper and look at the actual results delivered over time. And what we look to focus in on is just this large number of positive relative returns for clubs out that have a few decades of operation. Again, just reinforcement on those four major components of quality: financial strength, earnings stability, and then those competitive comparisons for profitability and growth. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and switch presenters over back to Kurt, back to Hugh. Give you control of the screen so that you can take it from here, Hugh.
Okay.
And again, if you have any questions on any part of that investment club stuff, and we will be talking more about the stock twit stuff as we go along, we'd certainly love to hear from you. So with that, I give you Hugh McManus. And again, for those of you that don't know Hugh, let me just kind of spend just a moment kicking him off here. You know, we've known Hugh within our long-term investing community for at least a couple of decades now, and I regard him first as a friend, second as a long-term investor, but then somebody who knows a little bit about what goes on in the pharmaceutical industry. He did his undergraduate work at Notre Dame and his postgraduate work at the University of Houston, and he's served in a number of pharmaceutical-related companies in a variety of capacities. But again, we really do tend to think of him first as a friend, second as a long-term investor that has some really keen insights and a long-term perception and perspective that I admire. Somebody who really thinks in terms of 5, 10, and 20-year perspectives on many of the companies that we engage. So with that, again, thanks for chiming in with us tonight, Hugh, and take it away.
Thanks. I actually did the PhD at Notre Dame. I did undergrad in Ireland.
Okay, I got it.
Postdoc was in Houston.
Sorry.
No, just clarification there. And I did an MBA while I was doing a postdoc because it was free. That's an example of long-term. But, I mean, there is a speculative component to this as well, because in the approval process, there is the opportunity, I think, to make extraordinary returns during specific events in the process. And I think you understand the process reasonably well, then you can take advantage of what I would regard as mispricing often in the marketplace. There have been some very good examples recently. I think 2 years ago, Intermune was a good example. I think it has a drug, but it didn't have 2 successful phase 3 trials. So there was a lot of excitement that it was going to be approved, particularly after the FDA Advisory Committee gave the thumbs up. But at the PDUFA date, the date at which the FDA makes a decision, the agency elected not to grant it marketing approval, sent it what's called a complete response letter, and asked that it produce at least one more successful phase 3 clinical trial. Wasn't a surprise, for me at least, although when everyone else disagrees with you, it's very easy to second guess yourself. So in this talk, we were originally actually planning to look at Vivus this week, and in 2 weeks to look at Arena, and interspersed in that, both those talks would be a look at the development of drugs and the approval process. But it turns out that the FDA decided to extend the approval date for Vivus by 3 months. So then we decided we would just change things slightly, focus more on the development and the approval process in this talk, touching on both companies, and then go into greater detail in 2 weeks. We would also have the advantage, actually, that if people have specific questions or areas that they want covered, they can email either Mark or me, and the emails were given at the start, and you could pose those questions. And certainly if you want a copy of this talk and you haven't access to the Manifest site, just ask, not a problem. There are a lot of slides here, so I'm going to try to move pretty briskly. First of all, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, it's part of the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a big agency. It has control over quite a bit of the economy. We've decided to exert that because it looks after food and drugs and a whole host of other areas, including cosmetics. The agency was founded in response to quackery, people taking shortcuts, in fact poisoning Americans with various elixirs that really had no benefit. And as I said, it now looks after cosmetics as well after 1938. It handles the drug approval process. So if you want to get approval for a drug in the 50 U.S. states and the Commonwealth, dominions, and territories, you have to go through the approval process dictated by the FDA. If you're just looking for approval in a single state, it's a good question. I was asked that recently, and I'm not really sure if the FDA would have jurisdiction in those circumstances. Now, the other agency that's big on the globe is the EMA, which is the FDA's equivalent in Europe. That's could be the subject of a whole other talk. It's a brand new entity compared to the FDA, and it really is slowly replacing the individual national regulatory authorities. The two work together in some convoluted type of fashion that I haven't really been able to discern greatly. But very often today, companies will still go through the expense of getting approval country by country in Europe rather than going through EMEA as it's often called, European Medicines Agency. Why they do this, I've really never got a good answer other than it could be faster. Oh, my next slide thing isn't working well. Good, there we go. FDA is divided into a number of centers. And if you want a good explanation of how it all works, the FDA has a lot of information on its website. I'm going to touch on many of those resources as we go through this talk. For the approval process, we really focus on two divisions of the FDA. One is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and the other is Biologics. Now, I am giving this talk under the assumption that people on the other end aren't scientists, which is fine. But so I will try to direct it toward the layperson, as it were. And if that's not working out well, let me know. But the world is divided really into small molecules. Aspirin would be an example of a small molecule. And large molecules, a protein, a molecule that compared to aspirin would be thousands of times bigger. Biologics, as the name suggests, come from usually living sources, or they look like things that come from living sources, whereas drugs are often synthesized in a chemical plant. And in fact, if you look at the history of where drugs came from, they often came from pigment plants in Germany and on the East Coast. The FDA website, and we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at this because I realize time is moving fast. The FDA website has a lot of resources. Here we are clicked over to the FDA.gov. And we're going to look at a few areas later on, but the area that we're going to focus on will be advisory committees, which are involved in the process. We're going to look at areas where the FDA provides news and updates, and we're going to actually look at the drugs portion of the FDA website as well, or we're going to pull from that. There are documents here that I'm kind of surprised that a lot of people haven't really found or have access to, but I think as an investor, you're going to find them quite interesting and quite valuable. The FDA also has a what's new portion in many areas of many of the different divisions and centers. This is for drugs, and you can click on here, and we'll probably have to switch over. You can get an RSS feed. If you click on that, it will come into your browser every day or many times a day, and it will tell you what's new. And the interesting thing that was published just on the 19th, you can scroll down and see many details. The interesting thing that was published on the 19th, if you wish to click on it, are new molecular and biological approvals during 2011. It will list them all, and it looks at priority review for calendar year 2011. A lot of these were published last week. So interesting reading. You can look at all the companies that did well, and you can count up the number of new drug applications that were actually approved for marketing by the agency. So the FDA regulates a lot of the economy, and in fact, I was at a talk by a senior member of the FDA a number of years ago, and they estimated that if they were to exert their full authority, a couple of other agencies were there, so I think that's why the statement was made. If they were to exert their full authority, they would be regulating 80% of the economy. It generated a laugh. But food and drugs are the areas that are most familiar with, as is cosmetics. And food is looked after by the Center of Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, and the main focus of this talk is on drugs. And we can click on this link here. I have to scroll over again to look at where the FDA provides a lot of good information about the agency itself. There's a link to the video where it describes what it does and why it does. And it has a lot of useful little talks and vignettes and pieces of information that describe to the layperson the process for drug approval. A drug is actually, you might think of it as just being a tablet, or many people would call it a pill, but it's really a tablet or an injectable or whatever, but it really consists of an active ingredient, the thing that does the work, say the aspirin molecule, the inactive ingredients, all the powders and fillers that get the active ingredient to the point of the pain or where it needs to be, protects it as it goes through the gut or whatever, There's an approved form. Is it a tablet? Is it an injectable? Or the other 80 or 90 different ways you can deliver drugs. There's a label that is approved by the FDA. There is packaging, and there are inserts. And when you do marketing, you can only market based on what is approved by the agency. And if you make a label claim, you need a clinical trial or two to support it. Mark and I gave a presentation with Sanofi Aventis about a year or so ago, and one or two of the slides are borrowed from Sanofi. This is one of them, but their source is Campbell Alliance. But it really just shows for a successful drug, and many drugs are not successful, only about 30% are profitable. But for a successful drug, this shows the revenue growth over time. If you go to the left, you can see where it incurs costs for development. And this is where the drug starts to become profitable as it gains marketing approval by the FDA, and it's launched, and the sales start to improve. Once the patent expires, and the U.S. issues patents for 20 years, there are some circumstances which that can be extended, but once the patent expires and other companies are free to make generic forms of the drug, the first to do that, the first to get approved by FDA gets a little bit of a head start on the rest, but the market rapidly erodes as generic competition kicks in. You can let me know, Mark, if there are any questions or...
I will. Thank you.
And as I said before, it can take you've got 20 years of patent exclusivity, but it can take a long time to get a drug to a market. And we'll show you why in a second. The preclinical and the clinical steps, the development of the drug, can take 10 to 14 years. Depending on when you file the patent, that can eat a large chunk of the marketable life of the product. And you can start off maybe with 10,000 potential drugs, candidates, ultimately few will become programs, to end up with only one that becomes a marketable drug. They fail for a variety of reasons, usually toxicity issues early on. We'll chat about that. And maybe even efficacy issues as well occur more often than many of us would like to hope. But generally, companies get 6 to 10 years of market exclusivity, and then they have to go back and develop brand new drugs all over again. This slide came from Sanofi Aventis IR, but it really illustrates what I just said. They start off with 10,000 compounds in year 1, and by year 10 to 14, you end up with one marketed and approved drug. Then you get 6 or so years of market exclusivity, sometimes 10. And we'll go through the clinical trial process later on. And just as an overview, there are various stages in development. There's the discovery stage, when you can actually have compound libraries, perhaps millions of compounds that you would screen for activity. Those are whittled down to the few that you could put into preclinical development to look at more focused studies for toxicity, etc., and even early efficacy. And then you finally would put 1 or 2 molecules into the clinic. And there are 3 stages, phases 1 through 3, which we'll talk about. And the clinical development stage can take 6 to 8 years. Clinical trials are performed in humans. Everything else is pre-human. And they're investigated actually by people that are independent of generally at the pharmaceutical company, the clinical trials I'm talking about. It can take 6 months to a year after all of the data are compiled into what's called a new drug application, sent off to the FDA. It can take about a year for the FDA to review that, and then they will give an answer as to whether or not marketing approval has been granted. On average, the claim is that it costs between $800 million and $1 billion to get a drug to market, and that number includes all of those drugs that fail along the way. Most of the programs that enter phase 1 actually do not make it to market. But if you were fortunate enough to work for a company that had only successful drugs, of course, the cost of development is a lot lower. You can actually track that if you look at some emerging companies that have one single successful program. Perhaps in the early days, Vertex was a good model to look at, and that cost is probably then somewhere between $50 and $100 million. Unfortunately, their first drug to market didn't really perform that well, and that's a whole other story, because while it is very risky to develop a drug, selling it can be even more challenging, as shareholders think of Dendreon probably found out. So first thing you need to do to interrupt the course of a disease is you want to stop something in the body that is bad. And I think for me at least, the thing that I always keep in mind is that when you introduce a drug into a human or an animal, you're actually giving them a poison. You're giving them something that you want to destroy a biological process. And the challenge that you have is to make that poison specific to one event and neutral or indifferent to everything else, or even beneficial to other things if you're a real optimist. But you have some target, even say on the outside of the cell, and this is a model of the cell. Dig into this in a little bit more detail in the second talk, but not much more detail. But you might dig one of those, target something on the outside of the cell in the hope of interrupting the course of a disease. The old model that if you had a time machine and you went back to Vienna in the 1920s and you started to buy Adolf Hitler's art, would that change the whole things that happened afterwards, making him an artist rather than a bad guy who was going on killing people? But really you want to interrupt the flow of processes that trigger from a single event. And you need to find a target, and there are groups within pharmaceutical companies that focus on doing that. And you want to make sure that you understand the process. And there's much work involved in doing that and looking at biological targets and trying to pin them down. Now, you also need a mechanism of action. We're going to focus on that in a jiffy. And for the two diet drugs that we're talking about, Cunexa from Vivus and lorcaserin, which comes from Arena Pharmaceuticals, they're actually looking at two different targets. The first, which is lorcaserin, looks at a thing called the 5-HT2C. As you might imagine, because there's a 2C, there's a 2A and a 2B as well. And we look later at that because we can discover actually that if it targets 2A and 2B, it can cause collateral damage in the body. The problem, say, of coagulopathy, of problems in the heart. But we'll look at that in 2 weeks. But you want it to be very specific, ideally, to your target. And in this case, if it targets this receptor, the 5-HT2C, it generally can trigger the body to assume that it's satisfied and it's not hungry. It doesn't want to consume any more food. Cunexa, on the other hand, contains two molecules that have been marketed for many, many years. Topiramate is one. The target of that is unknown. It's an interesting molecule. Most of it actually goes through the body unscathed. I think 60 to 80% of it is flushed out without doing anything at all. And then phentermine, the other component, works in the adrenal glands. And again, it triggers a sense that you're not hungry. But we'll focus in on those in 2 weeks. And in fact, the FDA will publish more information on its website about lorcaserin, the Arena molecule, on or about May 8th. And we already have the information about Vivus. So what you need to figure out, and the FDA demands that you know this before it will approve a drug, is the mechanism of action, how it works. Generally, it's a lock and key type thing where you're producing a key that will stick into the lock and shut it down or trigger some other event. And model systems in the lab can give support to a given mechanism. And by the way, the mechanism sometimes changes over time as you learn more and more about the mechanism of action of your drug. But you need to present at least compelling scientific and rational bulletproof information to the FDA for this mechanism of action. And not only do you need to know the mechanism of action, but you need to know the biochemistry of the drug, what happens to it in the body. And there are important things called metabolites. And in releases from companies, you'll see that word pretty often. But metabolites are just compounds that are formed when the body gobbles up or metabolizes the drug, just like your body would metabolize food you put in the stomach, etc. But the metabolites, which could look somewhat similar to the drug itself, they can be active as well. In 2 weeks, we'll give an example of caffeine. It's kind of a drug, latches onto a receptor, produces three main metabolites. Those metabolites are also active in the body. And if the metabolite is active, you need to know a lot of information about that as well. And there are degradants as well. Things break down in pills or injectables, etc. And you need to know something about those. The goal the FDA has is the drug is safe and effective, and safe comes first. And the FDA, as all of us know, is really focused on keeping things safe. And when it doesn't happen, journalists get Pulitzer prizes for dinging the FDA on, say, a Vioxx or something like that. I'm going to skip this slide and go straight to this idea of first in class. that is a mechanism that is novel that people haven't seen before. I'll show you data that supports the idea that the approval rate for drugs that are first in class tends to be higher than those that are Me Too or follow-ons. The interesting thing about a follow-on drug, that's a drug that is launched, that follows a mechanism that is for an already approved drug. The second to market often actually generates more revenue than the first. So for first in class, you're looking at a brand new mechanism. The problem is that the FDA would have no experience with that mechanism, so there's a lot of guidance. So perhaps the reason for the success is the constant dialogue with the FDA and making sure that everything that you file is shipshape for the agency. There's also usually a new target, so there's novelty right across the board. And it can give the innovator a head start. So for example, the first company that invented the antacid, AstraZeneca, well, it wasn't AstraZeneca then, but that's because it didn't have a follow-on from its successful proton pump drug. And there's two words that you'll read a lot when you're talking about a mechanism of action. One is agonist and the other is antagonist. And an agonist, it's a drug that functions in a way that it actually binds to some kind of receptor or some kind of thing on a cell and triggers an event that you want. It triggers a response. So it functions like a biological entity. And the other type is an antagonist. And all an antagonist does is it arrives at a biochemical site of interest, it binds to it, and it blocks it. So the normal receptor that's trying to get, or the normal drug that's trying, entity that's trying to get to that receptor is blocked by your drug. So it's a little bit like when you're early at an airport and you discover that, yeah, we're early, that's great, but the bad news is that the gate is blocked by another plane that hasn't left yet. That plane, that wayward plane, is acting like an antagonist, blocking you from getting to the gate on time. And as I said earlier, companies literally have millions of molecules in their library that they're going to screen against these targets to see which one has activity. It's tougher, I think, if you're looking at an agonist versus an antagonist. But still, that process is highly developed. It's robotic. It's repetitive. The protocols for carrying out this screening are well developed. They are changing all the time, too, as new technologies make these well plates smaller and smaller, etc. And the process is different, but it's very well developed. Vivus actually licensed its drug. It's often a good way to go. Companies can get things to market quicker if some of the heavy lifting is done already. Whereas Arena was originally a screening company that looked at a thing called the G-protein coupled receptor, or GPCR, which you often see in the releases. These are just molecules that are found sitting in the wall of a cell. A cell is like a big football, except the skin actually isn't tough and hard. It's actually made up of an oily kind of a substance, and there are molecules embedded in that skin, and some of the molecules actually do work. They talk to things on the outside of the cell, and then they communicate information to the inside of the cell. And GPCRs are a class of that type of a molecule. And about 30 to 40% of drugs in the market target GPCRs in some way. That's Arena's area of expertise. And just so you understand a little bit more about this whole development process in drugs, the goal is to make things safe and effective, and there are a number of areas, a number of different disciplines involved in reaching that goal. One is called pharmacokinetics, and the other is pharmacodynamics. PK and PD, you'll often see those two abbreviations. Pharmacodynamics is pretty, I could get shot for saying this. It's pretty easy because all you're looking at is the fate of the drug. You're looking at what the drug does on the body, how it binds to the receptor, how long it stays there, maybe the concentration in the blood, etc. Pharmacokinetics, on the other hand, is looking at what the body does to the drug. It's often coupled with drug metabolism. And you're looking at how the body gobbles up the drug, where it goes, what metabolites are formed. We talked on that earlier. Are those metabolites active? Is there any kind of collateral damage to systems in the body? And you're also trying to determine the optimal dose. The goal is to have sufficient drug floating around the body that gets to the point of pain, the point where you want it to do its work, and that the body itself doesn't gobble it up or destroy it in other areas, like kidneys are hard at work doing that, or the liver, etc. And if you have to increase the dose of the amount of the material that you put into the body, is that going to do other damage? So there's a sweet spot between the amount of material you put into the body and the amount of material you actually get floating through the system. And you often get a curve that looks like this. That vertical axis from the bottom up to the top, that's just looking at the concentration of the active ingredient that you want in the blood. And that horizontal one from left to right just looks at time. And you want to make sure that you get a nice curve, you get a sufficient concentration of material in the body, and it lingers for a sufficient amount of time, usually hours. You don't want, and so a lot of work is done to make sure that you can reach that maximum concentration, that beneficial concentration, without generating any bad side effects. And there's another term that you might hear, which is abbreviated as ADME, but it means absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. And that's just really echoing what I just talked about, the fate of the drug in the body and where it goes. And it's often combined with tox, ADME tox, where toxicity is looking at that term that I used before, collateral damage. Doing things that aren't good for the body and might actually be marginally harmful. Some of these things are often called adverse events, and some of them really aren't that bad. They might make you feel flush or generate flu-like symptoms, but if there is a benefit that outweighs those small side effects, then perhaps those side effects could be tolerable. And increasingly, the activity of a drug, particularly when it comes to toxicity, is being modeled in what's called in silico on computer systems, and they tend to be growingly effective, increasingly effective. Hey, I made up an adverb there. And I just talked about in silico there, but things are often modeled on computers. Then they're modeled in vitro in glassware, where you have cell lines or whatever. You have biological systems isolated in the lab, and you're doing experiments in the lab. You can get a lot of information about toxicity from there. You can get a lot of information about metabolites. The thing you don't get is how that one particular cell line or one particular substrate affects the rest of the body when you start putting compound in there. And there you have to use whole living systems. Before you can even consider using humans for experiments with drugs, you have to test the compound in animals. And this is actually a somewhat controversial area. It's an area that I think everyone would agree is not optimal. You prefer not to have to do this, but there's really at the moment no way around it. Model systems in computers or model systems in vitro in glassware do not work well enough. And in fact, there's a whole legacy of information based on in vivo systems that have to be followed. And you usually start with hamsters, as they will, proverbial guinea pigs, but they're actually rats. You move up through dogs, into primates, and eventually into humans. And, you know, if you met one of these lab dogs, they wouldn't be really familiar to you. They don't act like normal dogs. They're a special breed of animal, as are the rats, because you want as much consistency as you can. And there are primates and primate research centers that have worked in the pharmaceutical industry much longer than I have. I don't know how they get paid, but I'm sure they're doing quite well. But they retire gracefully and have made major contributions. In fact, as one researcher told me from an emerging company, they were very worried about going to a primate research center. They wanted to be absolutely sure there was absolutely no toxicity, because they figured that if they did any damage at all to the primates, they would never get into that center again. Their careers would be finished. Just one more expression that you often hear. It's the no adverse effect level in the most sensitive animal, and that's often used to start dosing studies. You usually go at a level that's significantly lower than that. And by the way, when I'm talking about dose, I'm talking usually about the amount of material per kilogram of body weight, or per pound, but really it's per kilo. Engineers talk about pounds. And then you have to make a decision on the dosage form. You have to decide if it's going to be a tablet, and in the US, most people like tablets. Different countries like injectable forms of drugs. Some even like suppositories, but for the most part, tablets are the way to go if you can possibly do it. And they're actually optimized for small molecules. Proteins are a different story. And there's just a picture that I grabbed of the web of various little dosage forms. So, once everything is done, and once you've demonstrated to the best of your ability the drug is safe and likely to be effective, you can then start a clinical trial. And a clinical trial is a controlled experiment where the drug is administered to humans in a controlled setting. They're generally double-blind. That means that the person administering the drug and the person receiving the drug doesn't know if they're getting the drug or a control. The proverbial placebo, or in many cases for life-threatening illnesses, the standard of care. They're also randomized, and the randomization occurs even before the first patient is dosed. So it's run according to a specific protocol, which we'll talk about in a second. The initial goal is to determine safety, and in fact safety is always a concern. And as you move through the clinical trial process, you want to also make sure the drug works. You don't want to actually try to sell sugar pills. And ideally, you want to make sure that if a subject is going to assume risk, they should assume about as much risk as they do in their regular life, or if there's benefit to be had from the drug, that it more than compensates for the risk that they incur. And these clinical trials are carried out under a philosophy of good clinical practices, just like manufacturing is not carried out under good manufacturing practices, and even review and submission of NDAs and INDAs is carried out under a good submission practice, which we'll chat about in a second. And clinical trials are conducted in hospitals or similar settings, certainly phases 2 and 3. And just in brief, and this slide comes from Sanofi Aventis again, so thanks one more time to them. In the very first set, you want to make sure that the drug is safe and that it's well tolerated, i.e. very minimal bad side effects. And you can have as few as 5 people in an early stage trial or as many as 100. By phase 2, you're starting to look at dosing and you're starting to look at whether or not the drug works. That experiment can be much larger, comprising up to 300 people. You're generally looking against what are called surrogate endpoints, i.e. endpoints that aren't part of the official guidance from FDA but would have been agreed upon by the FDA. And when you get to phase 3, these are pivotal studies. You're running the studies against a guidance or against an agreement with FDA, and you want to make sure that the drug works. You're doing a real-world study. You're using patients that are likely to resemble the people who will take the drug if it is approved. And these are the trials that matter the most. Although successful phase 2, to me, has always been a good predictor of what could happen in phase 3. I talked about a protocol. So before you start a clinical trial, you really have to define what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, the results that you expect, how you're going to analyze them. Everything is done up front so there are no surprises, and you don't have the ability to analyze your results after you get them, changing the rules, saying, well, if we'd done this, if we had done that, the trial would have worked. You specify everything, who the people are, what are you going to do if they walk away from the trial, what are you going to do if there are adverse events, how you're going to divvy up the people between the control group and the active group, etc., etc., etc. Almost every contingency needs to be thought about, including how the drug will be analyzed and what you do once the study is unblinded. And everything is run under a protocol, and it's generally developed by scientific advisors, not the people who are administering the trial in a hospital setting. So in a sense, there's an arm's length relationship there. And as I said before, if you discover the drug works, but under different circumstances, if you didn't specify those in your protocol, too bad. Retrospective analysis is not something that the FDA really goes for. Although they are suckers for a good scientific argument, but I don't know of examples where retrospective analysis really works out well. Studies of endpoints, and these are things that are measurable, they're determined before the trial, they're usually established in FDA guidance, unless, for example, it's a brand new mechanism of action, and there you would agree with the FDA on what to do at the get-go. And they have to be achieved for a trial to be successful. And so, for example, an example of an endpoint might be lowering the cholesterol level, and you define exactly what that means, how it's measured, how you know it's lowered, say by 20%. And you would measure it against a placebo or maybe a control group that's taking a different kind of medicine. Survival is a good endpoint, but in many cases today with fatal diseases, surrogate or other markers are usually used. Extension of life by a certain number of months versus the control group would be an example. There are secondary endpoints as well. These are usually softer. For the example we'll talk about in 2 weeks for the weight reduction drugs, you're looking at lowering of blood pressure, sugar levels, etc., etc. And then I talked about surrogate endpoints, which is a different breed of animal. They are again demonstrating that the drug is effective, but not necessarily doing it in the way that's specified in the regulatory guidelines. But it's agreed upon by the FDA, and that's something that often occurs in a phase 2 trial. You might look at surrogate endpoints to show that the drug works, and it actually can often speed up a process to getting to your next trial. And then the other abbreviations that you often see are adverse events and serious adverse events. These are often called side effects. Obviously, you want to minimize those. The companies themselves actually don't conduct the clinical trials. They fund investigators to do that for them. And they're, as I said, paid for by drug companies, but happen in clinical settings in hospitals, etc. And the independent investigators often publish the results, and those papers are usually available on the websites, particularly of emerging companies. I'm often asked, does FDA conduct clinical trials? Not for drugs going through the approval process, and they don't do experiments to verify whether or not the clinical trials were accurate. They don't set their own clinical trial. But they look at the data that companies present, and they make a decision on whether or not things were done appropriately. And we'll talk about this, the statistics behind a clinical trial, but it's not going to be math. Very little of it. But you're really assuming, perhaps at the get-go, that it doesn't work. I mean, the clinical trial will demonstrate, yes, in fact, the drug does work. It's more effective than the control group with a placebo. And you have to account for things like people dropping out, and you have to make sure that you have enough people in your trial so that it doesn't fail by chance. I mean, there's always a chance that a good drug will not meet its endpoint for various different reasons, just the way life is. But if the trial is sufficiently powered, that's the term that's used, then that possibility is minimized. And there was an example recently where they were looking at valvulopathy for, I believe it was for lorcaserin, which is the drug from Arena, and it turns out the FDA assumption was that about 5% of patients would develop this condition. It turns out it was fewer. It was about 1 to 2%. And under those circumstances, the trial looking for it wasn't powered enough to catch that. Just one of the little kind of sad things that can happen now and again in a process. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about the clinicaltrials.gov, where you can get lots of information. But if you type in the word lorcaserin into clinicaltrials.gov, you'll be brought to here. And by the way, I've checked lots of boxes in advance. And you can see all the now 9 clinical trials that Arena has conducted, where they call the drug lorcaserin. Sometimes earlier clinical trials where it may not have been called lorcaserin, but might have been given an abbreviation. They might show up in this search. But you can, if you check the sufficient boxes, you can learn a lot about the trial, including the number enrolled, when the trial started, when it ended, the style of the trial, how it was designed, etc. And there were 7 trials. Just for, I know this is a very politicized Conexa versus lorcaserin thing for some reason, but I'm not showing favoritism. Here we go. There's lots of trials also for Conexa. So clinicaltrials.gov is a great site and a great website, and has become very popular in the last 5 years, I believe, when it was created. As I said before, not all trials are against a placebo or against a proverbial sugar pill. It would be unethical to ask a patient who risks dying to take a sugar pill when there's a standard of care out there. In fact, beating a standard of care isn't a bad way to go. And once everything looks good in the clinic, and you believe that you have an effective drug in phase 2, toxicity models are ready, then you're ready to go to the FDA and have this phase 1 pre-IND meeting and talk to them. And interestingly, I'll show you the source of this information in a jiffy, but about 40% of NDAs with problems identified in pre-submission are approved, but 19% of those where you're not in dialogue with the FDA or you don't present these problems, a much fewer percent, about half of them, compared to the where the problems are identified, where they're not identified, they end up not getting approved. It's another, you'll hear this from me a lot, get into dialogue with the FDA and keep in discussion with them. So once you're convinced that things work well in animals, preclinical work, etc., in vitro, in vivo, you go through the process of filing what's called an IND, an investigational new drug. And that process is actually pretty simple. If the FDA has any problem, they will let you know. They don't respond within 30 days. You're free to go ahead, but point of the story is keep in constant dialogue with the agency. The phase 1 trial is to make sure that the drug doesn't cause any major problems. Toxicity is suspected. There should be benefits, but you want to make sure that the drug gets to where it needs to go, that the concentration in the body is sufficient. And you keep the dose pretty low at the start, about 1/100th of where you know toxicity occurred in animals. And if you know then it's safe, then you can start moving up from moving down towards the level where you knew there were no adverse effects in the most sensitive animals. You're looking at tolerance, so people can handle the drug. You start with a low dose and you might escalate it slowly. If there are serious toxicity issues, that's a problem in phase 1. And sometimes you can measure against placebo when you're looking at multiple doses. The doses where you've got the nice concentration in the blood of animals, and you want to make sure you can mimic that also in humans. Phase 2 is the next trial. Here you're starting to look a little bit more at efficacy. You're trying to see if those surrogate endpoints can be reached before you do the major trial to demonstrate the drug is effective. Again, you divide the world into control groups and active. Usually it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. And you have ongoing animal studies and toxicity all the time to make sure that there's nothing surprising in phase 2. Now, I just want to make one comment. My observation has been that phase 2 is often the most critical. And if things work in phase 2, I think you should be able to get a drug to work in phase 3. Now, there are surprises in phase 3 naturally. But phase 2 should be the determining point, and you should be pretty convinced of success for a company who's into phase 3. Some of the phase 3 results in the diet drugs or the obesity drugs we're looking at probably a little bit disappointing. The challenges in phase 2 can be getting the dosing right, making sure the trial is properly sized so that the results you get are meaningful. The other interesting thing about a phase 2 trial, it could possibly be the first time that you're working in a clinical setting. You might be dealing with people that haven't really conducted a clinical trial before, aren't used to the regulatory envelope that's wrapped around it. So adherence to the protocol is critical, and any deviation from the protocol should be noted and dealt with. Not punishing people or anything like that. But you're dealing often with surrogate endpoints. Sometimes you're looking at the endpoints and the guidance. But if things don't work out well, yeah, it can kill the program, but if you have a good explanation for this, you can get a second bite of the cherry in your company and start another phase 2 clinical trial if you really think you have a drug. Sometimes the FDA grants what's called a special protocol assessment. And in this case, the indication you're looking at, or the disease, could be very, very serious. It may not have anything else treating it. And in those circumstances, the FDA gets intimately involved with the company to develop the protocols to make sure the drug at least is fairly assessed, not to make sure that it gets approved, but that the process is working. The company doesn't make some silly mistakes. Never guarantees approval, but it certainly is part of the health mandate of the agency. Major companies often don't publish some of the events they have with the FDA, but they are material for emerging companies. And one of the things that occurs at the end of the phase 2 trials is a meeting with the FDA to sit on a plan for the phase 3 trials to work that out. Here you're going to look at the endpoints that are either in the guidance or agreed upon with FDA. Surrogate endpoints probably won't work anymore here. I provided a link to the draft guidance for weight management drugs, and that can be found on the FDA website. Today, about 78% of sponsors, i.e. pharmaceutical companies, participate in an end-of-phase 2 meeting. That's up from about 4 or 5 years ago. And I think success of this meeting is actually critical if you want to be successful in the phase 3 trial. And here is an example, actually, which contradicts just what I said, because the FDA had a research report carried out by Guzal and Hamilton, and I have a link to that at the end of this talk. You can actually get lots of data on the whole process for the clinical trials and interactions with the agency. Here they demonstrated actually that to some extent there really wasn't a strong link between successful end of phase 2 meetings. But for me, it's just I've seen it time and time again. Successful phase 2 meetings are quite indicative of how things will move forward. But that's subjective. What I just presented was objective. Phase 3 tougher world completely. Here you're looking at the drug in a real-world setting. It's administered against placebo or standard of care. FDA wants something to be, a trial to be randomized, and it has to be controlled and blinded, most critically, that people who are administering the drug and people receiving the drug don't know whether or not this is the drug or the standard of care / placebo. Depending on the indication, these studies can last for months to years and can involve thousands of volunteers. But a company, to get a drug approved, generally needs to show statistical significance against the control in 2 separate independent phase 3 clinical trials. So we'll talk about this in the next talk, but usually you can say maybe there's a 1 in 20 or a 1 in 100 possibility that the result happened by chance. And one of the goals is to have 2 trials, so the idea that a kind of a rare event could happen twice in a row is slimmer. But if you have 2 successful phase 3 clinical trials, there are very good chances, presuming if you analyze the data correctly and the protocol was adhered to, you don't have bad adverse events, the drug could be approvable. One of the other challenges in phase 3 trials is by the time those trials are unblinded, a lot of other data comes before, including long-term toxicity studies in rats. And Arena bumped into this right before their first meeting with the FDA Advisory Committee in 2010, when their rats showed cancer. And it was unfortunate that it occurred apparently very close to the meeting, and they actually didn't have enough time, or I'm guessing, I don't know, but they didn't seem to provide sufficient information to the advisory committee to allay their fears that this could be indicative of cancer in humans. And some would argue, and some have written about it recently, that they still haven't done that. Some abbreviations you often see when people talk about clinical trials are intent to treat, and the last observation carried forward. So that means if somebody walks out of the trial after day 2, and for an obesity trial, that could be bad because they haven't lost any weight at that point, you would imagine. But whatever they weighed in at is the number that's carried forward right to the end of the trial. And this is to avoid some kind of a bias where you would only then base your result on the people who last at the end of the trial, who differentially are probably those people for whom the drug was successful. The FDA sometimes grants what's called fast-track approval to certain drugs. Again, you get to work intimately with the FDA. The drug would have to show that it has exceptional characteristics. It's very superior, very much superior to the current drugs or treatments on the market. And the company can request this, and it's granted by FDA. It usually happens around phase 2 or thereabouts. And then accelerated approval, here you would use surrogate endpoints, markers in the body in some way, say tumor shrinkage in cancer rather than removal of the tumor altogether. The goal might be life extension by some trial, by some small amount. But it's used to analyze results, and this is another designation that's granted by the agency. Orphan drug status, just wanted to touch on this, but if a population of patients is fewer than about 200,000 in the U.S., there is a way that you can have orphan drug status, and you can get certain benefits, incentives for you to develop the drug and market to this small population. There is a program run by the FDA. I have a link to the Orphan Drug Grant Program that I think is very highly successful. There are a lot of drugs on the market that came out of this program. Good idea for investors to look at companies that have grants from this program, because that more than average number of them tend to be successful. So after you've got your phase 3 trials successfully, your phase 3 trials rather successfully concluded, you need to wrap everything up into a filing, a new drug application or NDA, and submit that to the agency. Since 2005, the agency has developed good review management principles, GRMP, which you'll see often, and I provided a link to that document. And about 75% of companies that follow these guidelines, about 80% of the time, get approval in the first cycle. That is the first PDUFA date they are approved. Whereas about those that only follow it about 20% of the time, they only get approved in the first cycle half the time. The FDA would also host a pre-NDA meeting where you can hash out issues, explain the clinical trials of them, etc., let them know what is coming. And then the big day comes when you actually file the application with the agency. The filing is enormous, but lots of information is included, from preclinical all the way through the clinical trials to even things that occurred after the clinical trials were concluded. And you provide details on how it's manufactured, how you want to package it, how it would be labeled. And this is all agreed with the FDA if they're going to grant approval. Interestingly, the FDA has reported that it receives 44% of submissions in the fourth quarter. And this is a total of 185 that it received from 2002 to 2007. And of those 185, basically here, this is the fate. 93%, but half get approved on the first cycle, and the rest have to go through multiple cycles before approval. And I provided a link to where you can find that information. And I'm not going to go through this table, and you can download the slides and take a look at the fate of drugs that get approved on the first try, whether they are NDAs, new drug applications, whether they're biologicals, small molecule, the approval rate for each, and whether it's a standard or a priority review. Priority reviews tend to get a little bit higher rate of approval. When I say a little, about twice as high as standard review. And we talked about mechanism of action, and again, the link is provided in the bottom where you can find this, but if it's novel, if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner box, you will see that if it's non-life-threatening, but it has a novel mechanism of action, it gets through the FDA approval process on the first go, but twice as often if it's not novel. And it gets through a little bit more frequently for life-threatening as well. Novel mechanisms of actions, counterintuitively, I think, tend to do better with FDA than existing mechanisms of actions that are well understood. I'll skip through this one. I'll just show you a picture of a lot of boxes of proverbial NDA filing, where all the data is included. Lots of it is electronic nowadays, and the FDA is moving in that direction. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act was enacted in 1992, and it's a process by which the FDA collects fees from people, from companies, to review drugs. It did that so that it could hire more reviewers and speed up the entire process. And it has been extended or reenacted a number of times, and the next one should be happening this year. The big one was in 2007, where the Food, Drug Administration's Amendments Act was filed, and there was you can download that actually from the FDA website. It includes a lot of information. But the bottom line is that the FDA now gets money more often than not from sponsors of new drug applications to help cover the cost of review. And they will issue what's called a PDUFA date, the date on which they make a decision. Unfortunately for Vivus and Conexa, that date was actually extended by 3 months. After you file, there's this proverbial thing called a 74-day letter. So the FDA reviews the NDA and makes sure everything is where it should be. It's not making a decision, but it's saying actually that looks like this FDA is set for filing. And they can do a number of things. They can say, yes, we'll look at it, we'll go through the process of analyzing your FDA. We will issue a PDUFA date, the date on which we'll make a decision. And they can either grant it a standard review, which is 10 months from the date of filing, or priority review, which is 6 months. And both Lorcaserin and Conexa, this current round, were granted priority reviews of 6 months. If things aren't in order, they would issue a refusal to file. And then you have to go and fix things and refile. And this is actually the fate of companies that had problems initially with their filing and what happened to them. And in most cases, when these are problems that weren't addressed, by the way, in the 74-day later. In most cases where the problem wasn't addressed, the company ended up not getting their NDA approved by the agency. During the entire filing process, which, as I said, lasts 6 to 10 months, the FDA can go back and forth looking for more information, clarifications, etc. And the dialogue can be quite intense between the agency and the sponsor. Right now, the FDA is working with Vivus to develop what's called a REMS, or Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy for Conexa. They want to make sure that in certain circumstances this drug could be harmful, and they want to make sure that those circumstances can be successfully avoided. As I said, every drug is a poison. It's shutting down a biological process or interfering with it in some fashion. And there are certain circumstances where a drug is good for some people, but not all. We'll touch on that in 2 weeks. So, the slide got out of order when I was moving things around. But if you scroll down to the bottom, from 2002 to 7, about 68% of drugs that were granted priority review had approval in the first cycle, whereas only 36% of those with standard review got approved in the first cycle. And the FDA then will, once they get the application, they visit the manufacturing and packaging facilities, could visit the clinical sites as well, request more information, may even schedule a meeting of independent experts for advice on what to do. And the FDA will often inspect manufacturing plants that can arrive unannounced in the US or with a few weeks' notice overseas, but it's a process where they want to make sure that the drug is made according to good manufacturing practices. And it turns out there's not a lot of difference in approval depending on where the drug is made, in the US or overseas. So the other thing I just want to say is sometimes drugs get turned on because of what's happening in the chemistry, manufacturing, and control section of the NDA, and the stock price gets whacked as a result. I've often noticed that this is eminently fixable, and the stock can actually bounce back again. So if an NDA is declined because of problems in what's called the CMC section, that's not always a bad thing. It's not a good thing for the company, but it's not bad either. And then the big event that occurs is a meeting with an advisory committee, an independent committee of panels, and we'll talk more about that in 2 weeks. But generally, if it's a new chemical entity or a new mechanism of action, it will be referred to an AdCom. If it's understood well, it won't. So Avanafil, which is a drug that is produced by Vivus for erectile dysfunction, uses a mechanism of action that is well understood, so it was not referred towards an advisory committee. But the FDA wants an independent opinion on it. Some people will cynically say they want to cover it. But it's a very rich source of information about the drug, and I'll just briefly click over to the advisory committee that handles both Conexa and Lorcaserin. Hey, I know we're running over, but I'll finish up soon. And lots of information here. If you click on the meetings material, it will show you where to go to find the data, the information from the particular session on the 22nd of February, where Conexa appeared before the committee. It doesn't yet have the transcript from that meeting, but it should appear next week. I was bothering Paul Tran about that recently. And on the 10th of May, which is in less than 2 weeks from now, Lorcaserin will appear before this advisory committee. And we don't need to look at this, but you can find information on the roster, the agenda, the questions. You can go on the website and you can actually find information on the bios of the particular people involved. For the endocrinological committee, I think there are 11 standing members, and there are on that committee. There are 32 standing committees altogether, 18 panels. Panels look at instruments, committees look at drugs. And about a quarter of NDAs are referred towards an advisory committee. Generally, the FDA will say yes if the committee says yes. That happens in about 80 to 90% of cases. It's very rare for the FDA to turn around and say no, to say yes if a committee says no, but it has occurred. The FDA can actually respond then to the new drug application on or after the PDUFA date in a number of different ways. For Vivus, it actually said there's going to be a 3-month extension. That happens. If marketing approval is granted, you get an approval letter from the FDA. Interestingly, about 60%, 58, of large companies get approved in the first cycle. Smaller companies have a tougher time, only about 2/3 compared to big companies get approved, or 41%. And if it's not granted, as happened in 2010 with both Conexa and Lorcaserin, you get a complete response letter, and the agency details to you what you need to do to fix things. It shows deficiency in the filings, and it can be more detailed. And as I said before, if it is a problem in the CMC section, I generally get quite hopeful at that point, and I've benefited from buying the company when the stock price gets whacked, the company fixes things and then comes back. as I think happened, well, can't remember the name of the company, that'll come to me, happened 2 years ago. The desired outcome is to get an approval letter from the FDA. It authorizes the company to market the drug. It defines the packaging, etc., that you can work out with the agency, sometimes even ongoing dialogue with the FDA. A link to where you can find approvals. And yes, it's been tough since 1996 when PDUFA really kicked in. There was just a gush of drugs that came through the market and got approval. Things have leveled off up until 2007, but things are improving. Last year was a very good year, in the 10 or 12 years for approvals. I think there were 19 altogether. Drugs actually often get named twice. So for example, Lipitor has a generic name of atorvastatin, and that's defined by the United States Adopted Names Council. There's a link to some information on that, but there's 3 different entities that own or are involved with the US ANC. But the FDA has a say in this process as well, because it wants to make sure that you pick a name that won't easily be mixed up with another existing drug. And usually the last 4 letters of the generic name, 4 or so letters, are already designated for a particular indication. So you'll see a lot of molecules that end in the word statin or pril, things like this. Vivus is branded as Conexa. Arena's drug is branded as Lorcash with the generic name Lorcaserin. Conexa actually consists of 2 already marketed generic drugs. And once you get the drug approved, that's when often the real work begins, making sure that doctors prescribe it. Only about 30% of drugs are actually profitable. This is a tough area. Selling is tough. And after it's approved, there's ongoing market surveillance to make sure that there are no serious problems with the drug and that it actually works as advertised. And very often there are follow-on clinical trials to expand the label claims for the drug, what marketers can legally do in selling this drug to physicians. Just want to talk about 2 websites that I think you'll find very useful. One is a website called PDUFADate.com. I'll just click on that because the guy who started this site in June of 2010, that hasn't come up yet, but he publishes a list of upcoming PDUFA dates for various different drugs. By the way, that first one, Cell Therapeutics, I think they withdrew their NDA if I'm not mistaken. That has been a bit of a mess, that drug. But yeah, that one's gone. But you can stroll down and you can see that Vivus has a Vanafil scheduled for a decision on the 29th of this month. And if we scroll down further, well, I'm not going to do it, but when you click on the next page, you can see that June 27th, I think, is when Lorcaserin is up. And then the other site is FDA Tracker that I found recently. That is a fun site. Here we have a gentleman who is actually studying the various members of these advisory committees and actually trying to predict what he thinks the behavior is of these people, using a little bit of statistics to figure out, to try to predict whether or not there will be a vote in favor of a drug. The FDA has some excellent resources as well. One of the things they published in 2006 and 2008 is a review of the PDUFA performance. And it's a 60 or 70 page document that you can download from their site. You learn more about PDUFA fees as well, how much they charge. It's about $1 million. But this document, the FDA's first cycle review performance, which was the analysis of data from an independent source, Booz Allen, is really quite good, and certainly worth taking a read. So I apologize, I went over by 15 minutes.
I don't think you need to apologize, Hugh. I think you covered a wealth of material in a very nice frame of time. I will give you I would like to kind of give you a chance to underscore some of the stuff you've had to say here by offering you the first comment or question from Norm from Des Moines. And Norm is basically saying, and I think this is true, I think you need to underscore this for average investors out there. He was under the impression that the 20-year patent cycle started on approval, and he thinks what he heard you say was that the approval process time that can be anywhere from 10 to 14 years is actually embedded in that patent cycle. So I think
that's right.
I think
patent clock is ticking away.
Yeah, I think many investors are confused about when that clock starts ticking, so go ahead and reinforce that.
Yeah, it starts ticking actually when the patent is filed. And there are various ways in which it can be changed, but it certainly doesn't start, the patent clock doesn't start ticking after the drug is approved. I think in fairness, they probably should come up with a mechanism whereby patent clock ticks more slowly during the approval process, but that's not the case. Yeah,
that would make a lot of sense to give some type of a lag on that sort of thing. And then we also have Susan from Wisconsin. Susan Macholik is sharing that she worked for years as an oncology chemotherapist, and she just wanted to, well, first of all, say thanks for sharing all this information with people so that they can get a better look at the process. But she also says she collected data in phase 3 clinical trials with the Eastern Oncology Group. So she has seen this up close and personal. And she, again, is just expressing her thanks to you for helping investors to understand, how this process unwinds and unfolds for any approval.
A high-risk process, no doubt.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I had no idea that the maze or the gauntlet was quite this heady. So go ahead. We'll take questions and answers for another few minutes. If anybody wants to either raise your hand or chime in with a text comment or question, please do so. Hugh's got a couple other things he wants to hit on here. Go ahead, Hugh.
No, I was just going to say that we're going to revisit this issue in 2 weeks, when Sunday after, I think, the AdCom meeting with Norcaster. Originally, the idea was to focus on Vivus, as I said, at this talk, and then Norcaster for next. Turns out, actually, it's fortunate that Vivus had the 3-month extension for me, because it dawned on me that it didn't make much sense to divvy it up the way I wanted to. But we focused more on the clinical results, the companies themselves, in 2 weeks' time. And there'll be an announcement on the Manifest website. I think everyone who attended this talk is likely to get an invitation. It'll appear on the Facebook site, and I think there'll probably be another notice or two appearing in StockTwits. I'm curious as to how many people arrived here from StockTwits.
Well, I'm sure we can definitely take a look at some of those statistics. A couple of the participants are actually talking about that being Mother's Day. We might want to avoid Mother's Day.
Yeah,
but
that's a good point.
That's an approximate date. We'll probably work around that. Perhaps even shooting for a Saturday morning. I don't know if that would mess up people for Mother's Day weekend, but we'll give some thought to that and come out with an official date. There's also a question from the audience. What are we talking about when we talk about StockTwits? We are actually talking. We're actually talking about. Yeah, that actually could be taken in a very unusual way, I suppose. We're actually talking about a website. In fact, Hugh, if you want to dial it up, it's stocktwits.com, and we're finding it. For those of you that are familiar with Twitter and the Twitterverse, as it's called, it's basically a place where you can get kind of access to what I've come to discover as almost an adjunct research department. And what Hugh is going to show you is the stock-focused part of that world, in my opinion. Hugh, go ahead and embellish if you want. But stock.
Yeah, it's like Twitter, but in this case, people tweet on stocks.
Mm-hmm.
And if you stick the ticker symbol into your post, I don't know if it's 140 letters or whatever, but if you were to put Arena, it would be $ARNA. Then it appears in a thread that where everyone is discussing Arena. But yeah, it's I don't know if I have to sign in or how that works. Yeah, so there we're looking at Caremark, and then you have all kinds of people talking about Caremark in different ways, and we can embed links to various different things.
Yeah, and keep in mind that we're talking about a very broad spectrum, and again, at Manifest Investing, we respect a wide variety of styles. I mean, the long-term discipline process we talk about most often, but we know there's successful momentum investors out there, technical analysts. We even give a nod to the day traders and confess that most of us don't understand, but we can certainly learn from watching just about anybody and collecting decent information. And Hugh is now pulling up the thing on Arena Pharmaceuticals. And again, that's where some of you may have discovered this presentation. You can see that there are a few comments that have been made here in the last few hours.
Mm-hmm.
And again,
Eastern time.
Yeah, what I am.
Pacific time for me. Yeah.
Uh-huh. what I am finding is that every once in a while you get some real gems from just monitoring this stuff. You know, as a case in point, Hugh, why don't you click on the ticker symbol for Matthews, M-A-T-W, and we did post one of our studies under Matthews over here. I think I'll probably show up here because there's not quite as much. There you go. So one of our, and those are 8-minute videos where we basically walk through an analysis of a company using our approach to looking at the fundamentals. Okay, we are running at about, and by the way, Hugh, I don't think you ran over. I didn't expect you to come in much under 75 minutes. That's kind of the upper limit of the stuff we try to do for the recordings and things, and I think you did just fine.
Thanks. Apologies to anyone that was a problem.
I don't think it's a problem. I think we'll take last call for questions. We do have a roundtable coming up here on April 30th. That's Monday night. Hugh may even talk about some of this kind of stuff, but it's literally a gathering of 4 of us that get together and talk about our favorite stock ideas. We do keep track of a tracking portfolio from our ideas going back over the last couple of years, and we are stone cold serious about trying to be successful with the selections that we make. I unfortunately have picked a couple of falling knives in the last year that stung me pretty bad as part of this process, but it's all a learning exercise, and one where we hope to outperform the market in general over the long term, and I have every confidence that we'll do that. So with that, I think we'll just leave it at well, Dan Hess from North Carolina checks in and just says, Hugh, it's a superb presentation that helps all of us better understand, especially as investors, the extensive and complex approval process, and he just says thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
And of course, Dan is one of our beloved participants and contributors in our Manifest community. So with that, I think I'll just say we will be out with a date somewhere around that May 13th time frame, give or take. Try to stay away from Mother's Day in the process. And again, thanks, Hugh, for kicking this thing off. And I think it will be interesting. I will encourage our audience to kind of kick around some of the questions. You know, some that come to mind as I just sit here and brainstorm on some of the stuff we might kick around with Hugh is, you know, I kind of want to think about, you know, why do drug development pipelines, thinking about Pfizer or any of those type of companies, you know, why does the professional community basically share that there's such a mystery when they are so you know, elaborately covered? I don't even know how to frame the words for it. You know, the pipeline at a place like Pfizer, I understand the odds of successful tests and all the stuff that you've covered, but why are they such a mystery? There's just kind of some thoughts that you might think about here over the next couple weeks as we prepare. The second thought would be any favorite analysts in the area that seem to have a pretty good track record that we might lean on, or funds, professional money managers, just some of this kind of stuff that the average investor can perhaps lean on and learn from. And again, I would encourage everybody out there to just kind of form your thoughts, and I'll leave you with one last one. And again, as we build this out over the next couple of sessions, Hugh came to me about, I don't know, a little over a year or so ago, and we were specifically talking about these companies, and I believe there was a third that was in the battle for the obesity pill at the time.
Yeah. Or Exogen.
Yeah, and you basically came to me with a situation, and perhaps we'll get you to bare your soul on this one, Hugh, where you basically said that all the air had been taken out of these things and their stock prices were all down, where at a point, you know, again, acknowledging the fact that we're talking about speculative investing and risk capital, that kind of stuff, but you basically said, I don't see what can go wrong with betting on, you know, any one or two or all three of these companies, because it seemed at the time that the risk premium had been deflated or taken out of all three of them, kind of coincidentally. And
yeah,
you know, I just kind of like,
building.
Yeah, I would encourage you just kind of to share what you saw there, and you know, be specific about, you know, how might we recognize that sort of thing in the future also.
Okay. This is for the next time, I guess.
Right. And I'm just kind of throwing out some things, and again, encourage anybody and everybody out there to come to either one of us with, you know, that type of follow-up question or comment, and we can sort of try to build to that over the next few sessions. So with that,
Okay.
any closing comments, Hugh?
No, thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you found it valuable. If you need a copy of these talks, if you missed the email address or lose it or anything, I guess you can just request it in StockTwits on Arena or Vivus. I can reach out to you that way.
Yeah, and for those of you out there in the Twitterverse, if you just simply reach out to me at Manifest Invest, you'll reach me. And you want to give your handle on in the Twitter world, Hugh?
I think it's BioInvestor. God, I can't believe I can't remember that. Let me see if it looks like me. No, what was that?
And I'll just go ahead and put the screen back at me. And anyhow, we can put that information out there also. And again, I just wanted, while he was thinking about that, again, make sure that everybody has access to the two email addresses, once again, as we basically say goodnight.
And again, Slow and Steady.
Oh, that's right, Slow and Steady. So at Slow and Steady, all one word for Hugh, and for me it would be at Manifest Invest. And again, just let us know what you would like us to cover if you happen to need or need to comment on anything. So with that, I'll say good night and thank you to all of you out there and to Hugh for this presentation tonight.
Well, thank you.
All right, and we'll see you all later, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.